There are punishments that kill the body, and there are punishments that kill everything else first. Rome perfected the second kind. It is a cold morning in January of the year 104, before the Common Era, and the city of Rome is roaring. The streets between the Forum and the Capitol are so packed that people have climbed onto rooftops just to see. Trumpets blast over the noise. Drums pound a steady, rhythmic beat that you can feel in your chest from 3 blocks away. The rumble of wooden wheels on stone cuts through the roar of the crowd. Wagon after wagon rolls past, heaped with African gold, carved ivory, and weapons stripped from the dead, each one a piece of a kingdom that no longer exists. And then, near the end of the procession, chained behind a Roman general's chariot, comes a man the crowd has waited hours to see. He is stripped to the waist, his beard is matted, his hands are bound behind his back. He is a king. 6 years ago, he told his friends that Rome was a city for sale. Today, Rome is showing him what it does to men who buy and lose. In approximately 6 minutes, the time it takes to walk half a mile, Jugurtha of Numidia will be lowered on a ladder into a stone pit beneath the Roman Forum. He will die there in the dark, cold and alone, in less than a week. But here is what should stop you cold. The Romans did not have to keep him alive to kill him. They could have executed him on a Numidian battlefield 6 months earlier. Instead, they transported him 1,000 miles across the sea for one singular purpose, so that 500,000 people could watch him lose his humanity in public. For more than 300 years, Roman generals faced a question that no other ancient empire had fully answered. When you defeat a king, an anointed monarch, a living symbol of a nation, what exactly do you do with him? You would think the answer is simple. You kill him. But Rome almost never did. What Rome invented was something worse. And the genius of the system, the thing that makes it so disturbing across 20 centuries of distance, is that it was not improvised. It was learned, refined, and perfected one defeated king at a time. Each conquered monarch taught Rome something new about how to use a living body as a weapon of state policy. The core insight was this: execution ends things. It creates a martyr. A king killed cleanly on a battlefield becomes a hero to his people. Songs are written about his courage. His children inherit his cause and his legend. An executed king is more dangerous dead than alive because death gives him a story that no conqueror can control. The triumph does the opposite. It displays things. It gives the crowd time, hours, sometimes an entire day, to walk past a captive king and stare at him, to laugh, to spit, to see personally that the man who had once ruled a nation now wore chains that a Roman blacksmith had hammered specifically for him. The triumph did not kill the symbol. It degraded the symbol until the symbol meant nothing. And then, only then, in a dark room or a distant prison where no one would see and no one would remember, it quietly disposed of what remained. The words "worse than death" are not hyperbole. For a king in Rome, it was the entire point. The system began with a battle in northern Greece in the year 168, before the Common Era, where an entire dynasty was about to end. The Battle of Pydna lasted less than an hour. The Macedonian phalanx, once the most feared formation in the ancient world, the weapon that Alexander the Great had used to conquer from Egypt to India, broke apart against Roman legions on uneven ground. King Perseus of Macedon, the last legitimate heir to Alexander's empire, fled the field as his army disintegrated. He rode first to Pella, then to the sacred island of Samothrace, carrying what treasure and what family he could. His wife, 2 young sons, a daughter. He believed the ancient sanctuary rites of the temple would protect him. He believed wrong. Roman ships arrived within days. The priests did not lift a hand to stop them. Within 2 weeks of Pydna, Perseus was brought to a Roman camp and walked into the tent of Lucius Aemilius Paulus. He did not walk in as a king. He threw himself on the ground in despair. His children were with him. The youngest was a small boy, holding his father's hand. This is the moment that shaped everything that followed. Perseus is on the ground in front of Paulus. His children are beside him, the youngest gripping his father's robe. Paulus's officers watch from the edges of the tent, uncomfortable, aware that what happens next will set a precedent for generations. Soldiers press against the tent walls outside, trying to hear through canvas what history sounds like when it turns a corner. And Paulus does something that shocks the men present. He steps forward and raises Perseus up by the hand. He speaks to him gently in Greek, as one aristocrat to another. Then Perseus, still trembling, makes his plea. I entrust myself and my children to you and to the Romans in the hope that you will spare us. Paulus could have granted him honorable exile. He could have executed him quietly. He could have sent the children back to Macedonia and left the father to grow old in obscurity. Any of these would have been consistent with Greek and Persian tradition. Instead, his face hardened, and he delivered a line that told Perseus everything about the empire he was now inside. You should have thought of this earlier when you were negotiating with the enemies of Rome. Now the decision lies not with me, but with the Senate. In that sentence, Paulus told a defeated monarch that he was no longer a king, no longer a person with a fate. He was now the property of a state that would decide at leisure how his body would be used. Perseus was going to Rome. So were his children. So was everything they represented. The triumph of Aemilius Paulus lasted 3 full days. On the first day, confiscated Macedonian art rolled through the city. Statues and carvings stripped from Greek temples loaded onto 250 wagons. On the second day came the weapons. Rank after rank of captured shields and helmets piled so high the wagons groaned under the weight. On the third day came the money. 250 additional wagons carried nothing but coin and silver bullion, enough that Rome temporarily suspended direct taxation of its citizens because the Macedonian treasury alone could fund the state. If each wagon took 2 minutes to pass a given point on the road, the money alone took more than 8 hours to roll through the city. And this was one triumph for one king. Then came Perseus. He was made to walk at the end of the procession, chained in front of Paulus's chariot. But he did not walk alone. Ahead of him went his 3 small children, also in chains. The oldest could not have been more than 10. The youngest was small enough that the crowd could see him crying and clutching at his father's hand, not understanding what was happening or why so many strangers were shouting, "Stop and hold that image!" A 4-year-old boy walking through a foreign city in chains past hundreds of thousands of screaming people. He does not know his mother is dead. He does not know his kingdom is gone. He does not know that the language being shouted at him from every direction is a language he will eventually learn because he will never go home. He knows only that his hand hurts where the iron cuts into his wrist, and that his father, who has always been the strongest man he has ever known, is crying. The chains were not sized for a child. They were adult chains on a child's body. They would have dragged on the ground with every step. Every few paces the boy would have stumbled, and 500,000 Roman citizens would have watched a toddler trip over his own shackles on a stone road in a city built to celebrate exactly this kind of spectacle. And then the sources record something that tells you this system was never entirely comfortable, even for the Romans who invented it. Some in the crowd, citizens hardened by decades of wars across 3 continents, began to weep. Paulus himself, days later, is reported to have said, "I weep for the fortune of kings, yet I must obey the decrees of the Roman people." Personal pity did not matter. The state required this, and the state got it. After the triumph, Perseus was sent to a small town in central Italy called Alba Fucens. There he lived under guard in confinement. The sources cannot agree on how long. Some say months, some say 2 years. What they agree on is how he died. Alone in obscurity, possibly starved, possibly deliberately deprived of sleep by guards who kept him awake until his body simply stopped. The last king of Macedon vanished into an Italian jail cell, and no one alive today can point to his grave. He was the last legitimate heir to the empire of Alexander the Great, the inheritor of a dynasty that had conquered the known world 2 centuries earlier, and he died in a town so small that modern tourists drive through it without stopping. The cautious king was simply deleted from the world. His children were absorbed into Roman households, given Roman names, raised speaking Latin. Within a generation, the royal house of Macedon had been dissolved, not by execution, but by erasure. Rome did not kill the dynasty. Rome evaporated it. What Paulus had done to Perseus was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was the prototype for a system that Rome would operate for the next 3 centuries. The triumph was the oldest and most sacred ceremony in the Roman state. To hold one, a general had to have killed at least 5,000 enemies, ended a foreign war, and been formally granted the honor by the Senate. It was the highest reward Rome could give. And it had also become the empire's most refined weapon against defeated royalty. Everything about the ceremony was engineered for maximum humiliation. The procession followed a route approximately 3 miles long through the heart of Rome, and every foot of it was designed so the maximum number of citizens could watch. On triumph days, the population effectively doubled as people traveled from surrounding towns. Temporary stands were erected. Balconies were rented at prices that would have bought a modest farm. People climbed onto rooftops and hung from windows. 500,000 people packed into a corridor of human bodies that the procession moved through like a river through a canyon. Captives were made to walk in special garments, often altered versions of their own royal robes, deliberately shabby or torn, to remind the crowd that this man had once worn better. They marched near the end of the procession, after the wagon loads of loot, so the crowd was already worked into a frenzy of greed and excitement by the time the prisoners appeared. Their placement was the most deliberate detail of all. They were positioned directly in front of the general's chariot so that thousands of Roman citizens would see in a single visual line the 2 things Rome most wanted them to see: the victorious general above, and beneath his chariot wheels the humbled king he had made small. This was not punishment improvised in the heat of victory. This was state theater refined over generations. The route was planned. The timing was calculated. The garments were chosen, the chains were custom-made. Every element was designed to transform a living monarch into a symbol of Roman supremacy that 500,000 people could witness with their own eyes and carry in their memories for the rest of their lives. And then came the question that reveals the system's darkest layer. What do you do with the symbol once the show is over? 63 years after Perseus walked through Rome in chains, another king took the same walk. Jugurtha of Numidia was not new to Rome. As a young man, he had served with the Roman army in Spain. He had drunk with Roman officers, learned their language, their politics, their weaknesses, and their price. He understood the Republic the way a locksmith understands a lock, from the inside, every mechanism visible. When he inherited the Numidian throne, he used that intimate knowledge to murder his rivals and bribe Roman senators to look the other way. He purchased Roman policy the way a merchant purchases goods, openly, methodically, and with the confidence of a man who has studied what everything costs. It was during this period that the historian Sallust records his famous verdict on the Republic. Rome, he said, is a city for sale and would perish as soon as it found a buyer. The irony of that statement would find its sharpest edge on a January morning 60 years later. Jugurtha was 55 years old when Rome finally caught up with him. He was not defeated in battle. He was not out-generaled or out-fought. He was betrayed, handed over by his own father-in-law, Bocchus of Mauritania, at a diplomatic meeting arranged specifically for that purpose. Bocchus had invited Jugurtha to discuss alliance terms. Jugurtha arrived with a small escort, expecting negotiation. What he found were Roman soldiers waiting in an adjoining room. He was in chains before he understood what was happening. The man who had called Rome a city for sale had been sold by his own family for the price of Roman friendship. The triumph of Gaius Marius followed the same template Paulus had established with Perseus. Wagons of loot, weapons of the conquered, and at the end, the chained king walking before the general's chariot while the crowd screamed and threw things and celebrated the spectacle of a monarch reduced to a stumbling figure in torn robes. But Marius did not have the patience of Paulus. When the triumph ended, he did not send Jugurtha to a distant Italian town to fade away in obscurity. He sent him to a hole. The Tullianum, also called the Carcer, was Rome's most feared prison. It sat beneath the Forum itself, directly under the ground where Roman citizens conducted daily business. The prison consisted of 2 chambers, an upper room where prisoners could stand, and a lower room, accessible only by a ladder or a rope lowered through a hole in the floor. The lower chamber was carved from solid rock. It was dark. It was cold. The walls wept moisture that never dried. There was no window. There was no bed. There was barely room to lie down. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and the residue of every man who had died there before him. No light reached the lower chamber. A man lowered into that room would not see his own hand in front of his face. He would hear nothing except the footsteps of Romans walking above him on the Forum floor, going about their daily business while he died 12 feet beneath their shoes. Jugurtha was stripped of his remaining clothing. His earrings, gold, were torn from his ears so roughly they left wounds. The guards who stripped him were not cruel by nature. They were professionals, performing a function that the state required and the religion sanctified. Jugurtha was no longer a prisoner to them. He was a consecrated offering, being prepared for delivery to a god who lived in the temple on the hill above. As they lowered him into the pit, he reportedly laughed and said by Hercules, "Your bath is cold." It is the last recorded joke of a man who knew he was entering a room he would never leave. He was right. Jugurtha died in the Tullianum within approximately 6 days. The cause was probably a combination of exposure, starvation, and the psychological destruction of being locked in a stone box beneath the feet of the civilization that had consumed him. The king who had called Rome a city for sale died in a hole beneath the marketplace. The final case study is the cruelest because it reveals what the system looked like when operated by a genius. In the year 52 before the Common Era, on a hilltop fortress called Alesia, one of the most famous captives in Roman history sealed the template forever. His name was Vercingetorix. He was the son of a Celtic nobleman who had done what no other Gallic leader had ever managed. He united the fractious tribes of Gaul against Julius Caesar. When the relief army failed and starvation closed in, Vercingetorix surrendered himself to save his people. Here is the detail that defines the system. Caesar did not execute Vercingetorix that day. He did not execute him that year. He kept him alive, chained in a Roman cell, for 6 years. 6 years while Caesar fought a civil war against Pompey, crossed the Rubicon, was appointed dictator, reorganized the Roman state. 6 years so that Vercingetorix could walk in one afternoon's parade. Think about what that means. A human being kept in a stone room for 6 years for the sole purpose of being available on a specific Tuesday. Fed enough to stay alive, but not enough to stay strong. Guarded enough to prevent suicide because the system required a living body, not a corpse. Maintained like a prop in storage, waiting for the theater to open. For 6 years, Vercingetorix heard nothing of the war that was reshaping the world above his cell. He did not know when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. He did not know when Pompey fell. He did not know that the Republic was dying. He knew only that his cell was the same size today as it was yesterday, and would be the same size tomorrow. 6 years of identical days, 6 years of the same walls, the same darkness, the same food pushed through a slot, the same silence broken only by guards changing shift. And every one of those days existed for one purpose, so that one afternoon, for approximately 3 hours, Vercingetorix could walk through a city he had never seen, in chains he had worn for 6 years, past a crowd that did not know his name. Kings were no longer property to be destroyed. Kings were assets to be stored. When Caesar's quadruple triumph finally took place in 46 before the Common Era, Vercingetorix was brought out of his cell and marched through the streets of a Rome that had changed beyond recognition during his imprisonment. He had entered prison when the Republic still stood. He emerged into a dictatorship. The world had moved on. He had not. After the parade, Vercingetorix was taken to the Tullianum, the same pit where Jugurtha had died 58 years earlier, the same dark chamber, the same cold stone. Then there, in the underground room that had become Rome's designated disposal site for consumed monarchs, the same cold stone where Jugurtha had shivered and laughed and died 58 years earlier, Vercingetorix was strangled to death, not with ceremony, not with witnesses, not with any of the theater that had accompanied his walk through the streets. He was killed in the dark by hands that history did not bother to name. The man who had united Gaul, who had made Caesar fight harder than any enemy before or after, who had surrendered himself so that his people might live, was deleted in a hole beneath the feet of Roman shoppers. The system had achieved its final form. It could store a king for years, produce him on demand for a single day's spectacle, and then dispose of him in an hour. In the entire history of the Roman triumph, spanning more than 3 centuries of conquered monarchs, one and only one defeated ruler managed to escape the system. She was a woman, and what she chose instead remains one of the most calculated acts of defiance in the ancient world. Cleopatra VII of Egypt understood the Roman triumph in a way that Perseus and Jugurtha and Vercingetorix had not. She had lived in Rome. She had been Caesar's lover, and she had sat in the audience at triumphs, and she had watched defeated kings walk past in chains. She knew exactly what Octavian, the future Augustus, intended for her. She had seen the system from the inside. She knew the route the captive would walk. She knew the timing, the placement behind the chariot, the torn garments, the screaming crowd. She knew what happened to the children of defeated monarchs because she had watched Perseus's descendants disappear into Roman households and Jugurtha's memory dissolve into a joke about cold baths. Most importantly, she knew what happened in the Tullianum, the dark room, the cold stone, the slow deletion of a human being who had once been a god to millions. When Octavian's forces took Alexandria in 30 before the Common Era, Cleopatra was captured alive. Octavian was jubilant. He had the greatest prize any Roman general had ever taken, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who had seduced both Caesar and Mark Antony, the living symbol of the only Mediterranean power Rome had never fully controlled. He began planning a triumph that would eclipse every celebration Rome had ever seen. And then Cleopatra did the one thing Octavian had not prepared for. She killed herself. The method, whether asp or poison, has been debated by historians for 2,000 years. What is not debated is the calculation behind it. She understood with perfect clarity that alive she was a trophy, dead she was a problem. Octavian needed a living queen to walk behind his chariot. A dead queen was worthless to the triumph machine. She could not be paraded, she could not be displayed, she could not be slowly degraded into a symbol of Roman superiority, because you cannot degrade a corpse in a way that satisfies a crowd that came to see suffering. She saw that Octavian did not want her dead. He wanted her displayed, and she took away the one thing he needed, her living body, by making sure that when the guards broke down her door, they found a queen in her regalia on her throne, not on her knees, not in chains, not stumbling past a screaming crowd in torn robes, on her throne, dressed as a pharaoh, dead on her own terms. In death, she had composed herself the way she had composed herself for every public appearance of her 21-year reign. The makeup was applied. The royal cobra sat on her brow. Her hands were folded. She had staged her own death the way a director stages the final scene of a play, controlling the last image the world would see of her because it was the only image left that Rome could not take. She lost her kingdom. She kept her ending. In 3 centuries of defeated monarchs, Cleopatra was the only one who understood, before it was too late, that the ceremony was the point. And she denied Rome its ceremony by choosing the one thing Rome could not undo: her own death, staged as a final act of sovereignty. Here is what most modern histories leave out. The Romans themselves did not consider the triumph the cruelest part. They considered it the merciful part. The triumph was a legal and religious necessity, a purification ceremony for the returning army, tied to specific temple rituals. Perseus, Jugurtha, and Vercingetorix were technically consecrated to Jupiter Capitolinus. Their walk through Rome was, in Roman theology, a sacrifice offering. That is why they had to be alive to enter the city, and in most cases dead by the end of the day. What we see as spectacle, Rome saw as a temple ritual. The kings were not just being humiliated, they were being killed on an altar the size of a city. And this changes something fundamental about the system. Because if the triumph was a sacrifice, then the captive kings were not merely prisoners of war. They were sacred objects, consumable offerings. Rome was eating them. The system reshaped both sides of the equation. For Rome, it created a permanent psychological gap between Roman and foreign that even citizenship laws could never quite close. To be a foreign king was, in Roman civic imagination, to be someone whose highest fate was to be paraded and then quietly deleted. For the conquered peoples, it reshaped memory itself. The Macedonian dynasty ended not with a battle, but with a walk. Numidia's independence ended in a pit. Gaul's brief moment of unity ended with a strangling in the dark. Each of these endings became foundational trauma for the peoples who survived them. The stories were passed down for generations, always with the same haunted edge. This is what happens to kings who face Rome. This is what happens to their children. This is what happens to anyone who believes that courage and sovereignty are enough to survive an encounter with a machine that has been consuming monarchs for 3 centuries. Modern culture has rewritten most of these stories into cleaner shapes. Vercingetorix became a French national hero. Cleopatra became a feminist icon or a seductress depending on the century, and Jugurtha and Perseus, the men whose suffering built the template, have been forgotten almost entirely. Rome won more than the battles. Rome won the memory. And somewhere in the pattern of every European empire that followed, medieval captivities, early modern prisoner parades, the display of defeated leaders through capital cities as late as the 20th century, is the ghost of Perseus's small son holding his father's hand, walking through a foreign city in chains. Go back to where we began. January 104, before the Common Era. Jugurtha is walking through Rome. In 6 minutes, he will be dropped into a hole beneath the Forum. In 6 days, he will be dead. Now you know what you did not know at the start. His walk was not a punishment, it was a ceremony. His death in the Tullianum was not a private cruelty, it was a public ritual sacred to Jupiter. A ritual that Perseus's children, Vercingetorix's strangled body, and Cleopatra's desperate escape all shared in different ways. The true cruelty was not the chains or the pit, or the 6 years in a cell waiting for one afternoon's parade. The true cruelty was the way Rome, having taken a king's kingdom and his freedom, then took his story, rewrote it as a Roman story. A story in which the king was not a person but a prop, not a monarch but an offering, not a human being but a consumable object whose highest purpose was to be paraded and then quietly disposed of in the dark. Rome did not just defeat kings, it consumed them, and the spectacle required that the king be alive long enough to understand that the last thing he would ever be was a prop in someone else's triumph.